Tonight, we examine a rapidly evolving geopolitical narrative, one that stretches from Ankara to Jerusalem, from Washington to Tehran, and into the heart of global power politics. This is not a story of personalities alone. It is a story about strategy, sovereignty, perception, and the machinery of modern influence. Recently, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett issued a striking warning. He described what he called a new Turkish threat, arguing that Turkey, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is expanding its influence across Syria and the broader Middle East. He went further, characterizing Turkey as the new Iran. Such language carries weight. It signals not merely concern, but recalibration. But what does that recalibration mean? To understand this moment, we must step back. For decades, Israel's most immediate strategic concerns centered on Iran, its nuclear ambitions, its missile programs, and its regional proxies. However, as alliances shift and conflicts redraw boundaries, Turkey has emerged as a complex variable, a NATO member with independent ambitions, regional leverage, and growing influence in post-conflict Syria. The tension, analysts argue, may not be about imminent military confrontation. Rather, it is about sovereignty and strategic independence. When a regional power cannot be easily influenced or predicted, it introduces uncertainty. In great power competition, uncertainty itself becomes a perceived risk. The phrase Turkey is the new Iran is less about identical behavior and more about strategic positioning. It suggests a fear of encirclement, a concern that influence is consolidating in ways that challenge Israel's regional freedom of action. Yet this development does not unfold in isolation. Across the Atlantic, policymakers in Washington continue debating the scope of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. On a recent broadcast, U.S. Senator Tom Cotton outlined what he described as an extended air and naval campaign targeting Iran's missile infrastructure. He emphasized there were no plans for large-scale ground forces. But history reminds us that military engagements often evolve. Air campaigns carry risks. Aircraft can be downed. Rescue operations may escalate. Strategic objectives can expand beyond initial mandates. This raises a larger question. When leaders speak of limiting involvement, how durable are those limitations once operations begin? Throughout modern history, regime change efforts have rarely been accomplished solely from the air. From the Balkans to Iraq, military doctrine suggests that transforming political structures typically requires sustained presence, often on the ground. Even when policymakers avoid explicit language, strategic logic can imply broader commitments. And yet, public opinion often diverges from elite consensus. Polling over the years has consistently shown war fatigue among American voters. After prolonged campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, many citizens express caution toward new entanglements. Bipartisan leadership circles may align on security strategy, but alignment at the top does not automatically translate to enthusiasm at the grassroots. In parallel, regional realignments continue. Israel has strengthened ties with India, expanded security cooperation with Gulf states under the Abraham Accords, and deepened technological partnerships worldwide. Meanwhile, Turkey has balanced relationships with NATO, Russia, and emerging Asian markets, charting an independent path. This is not conspiracy. It is geopolitics. Great powers and regional powers seek advantage. They protect their interests. They compete for influence. The language of liberation or deterrence often overlays calculations rooted in security doctrine and national strategy. The media environment further shapes perception. How conflicts are framed influences how citizens interpret them. Terminology, defensive action, deterrent strike, stabilization mission carries narrative weight. The framing determines whether events appear reactive or proactive, necessary or optional. In the case of Israel and Turkey, the tension reflects deeper currents. Turkey's expanding drone industry, energy ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean, and posture toward Palestinian issues complicate its relationship with Israel. At the same time, economic interdependence between the two nations remains significant. Trade volumes persist even amid diplomatic strain. Contradictions define this era. Meanwhile, Iran remains central to the equation. Its missile capacity and nuclear infrastructure continue to dominate strategic discussions in Washington and Jerusalem. Policymakers argue that missile stockpiles present a direct risk to regional stability. Critics counter that escalation risks unintended consequences. The calculus is delicate. Military planners must consider deterrence credibility. Political leaders must consider domestic consent. Regional actors must calculate alliance structures. Each decision intersects with the others. An equally important dimension is China. As Beijing expands economic influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, Middle Eastern nations increasingly engage with Chinese technology, infrastructure financing, and defense partnerships. This introduces another layer of competition, one where technological alliances shape strategic alignment. In this environment, Israel evaluates partnerships carefully. India represents a growing defense customer and technology collaborator. Gulf states offer economic integration. The United States remains its most significant security partner. Turkey, however, stands in a more ambiguous category: ally, competitor, and occasional adversary simultaneously. Ambiguity fuels caution. The question then becomes, is the rhetoric escalating faster than the reality? Political language often sharpens during periods of uncertainty. Leaders use strong phrasing to signal resolve, both to domestic audiences and to rivals. Yet escalation carries risks. Once narratives harden, diplomatic flexibility narrows. At the same time, American policymakers must balance alliance commitments with domestic priorities. Economic pressures, infrastructure investment, border policy, and healthcare compete with foreign policy for attention and resources. When overseas operations expand, public scrutiny intensifies. This is not simply a story about conflict. It is a story about adaptation, about how states respond to pressure, about how markets influence policy, about how credibility shapes calculation, and about how, in a multipolar world, stability requires coordination rather than coercion. The international system is being tested militarily, economically, constitutionally, and diplomatically. The outcome will not be defined solely by battlefield exchanges, but by resilience, restraint, and strategic foresight. Understanding that broader context is essential. This is not just a war to watch. It is a turning point to understand. And the balance that emerges from it will define the next era of global order. This documentary is created for educational and informational purposes only. The analysis presented reflects publicly available information, historical context, and geopolitical research at the time of production. It does not promote violence, endorse military action, or advocate harm against any nation, government, or group. The views expressed are analytical in nature and intended to encourage critical thinking, informed discussion, and peaceful dialogue. Geopolitical situations are complex and evolving. Developments may change after publication. The Middle East has repeatedly demonstrated both volatility and resilience. As observers and citizens, the responsibility is not to amplify fear, but to understand context. Not to assume inevitability, but to evaluate trajectory. Strategic competition is real. So is the potential for recalibration. The coming months will reveal whether rhetoric transforms into action, or whether it remains signaling within a high-stakes negotiation landscape. Until then, one truth remains constant: informed publics strengthen democracies. Transparent debates reduce miscalculation. And balanced analysis creates space for accountability. Thank you for watching. If you found this investigative breakdown valuable, please subscribe, enable notifications, and join us as we continue examining the forces shaping our world clearly, carefully, and without sensationalism. This documentary is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The analysis presented is based on publicly available statements, media reports, and expert commentary at the time of production. The views discussed in this program reflect the perspectives of the individuals quoted, including public officials and commentators, and do not represent endorsements or verified conclusions. All geopolitical assessments are analytical in nature and should not be interpreted as definitive predictions or insider knowledge. This content does not promote violence, hostility, or harm toward any country, government, group, or individual. Discussions of military strategy, regional conflict, and political rhetoric are presented strictly within a journalistic and academic context. International affairs are complex and constantly evolving. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple reputable sources and form their own informed opinions. This channel is committed to balanced reporting, respectful dialogue, and fact-based analysis.